Alright, a good day to you all. My name is Mr. Matema, and I'm going to be taking you for A-Level Literature, ZIMSEC. And in particular today, we're going to be looking at the wonderful text by Chidalayenzi called The Ties That Bind. Alright, so today I'm just going to give you a brief analysis and how to analyze and how to bring out issues pertaining to HIV and AIDS. So what you are really looking at today is what does the writer say about the concept of HIV and AIDS? How does the writer present this using characters? How does the writer present this using literal devices and techniques? And what is the message? What is the attitude? How does the writer react to social attitudes? And what is the advocacy for the concept of HIV and AIDS? Alright, so the first thing you need to do is to look at what HIV and AIDS is like in the novel. So the first thing we're going to look at is the family, number one. Number two, we're going to look at the setting of the novel, what it does. Number three, we're going to look at relationships, right? Number four, we're also going to look at the overall social attitudes of the writer, right? Then number five, we are going to look at the ending of the novel, how the novel ends and the like. So the one thing that Chidalayenzi was looking at was an urban contemporary society. So when we're talking about the context of the novel, we are talking about an urban setting. Like you talk about high fields, you talk about the contemporary setting in Zimbabwe, right? And one of the major issues was HIV and AIDS, which was like a rampage, right? It was a rampage in our society. And the first thing that is noted by the writer is on how it affected the family setup. In particular, we are going to use the family of Jackie, right? So one of the things that we are going to look at is how HIV and AIDS affected across generations, which we call transgenerational effects of HIV and AIDS. And the writer, how he does this, he presents this through the third person narrator, right? All right, let me stop there. So what I'm basically saying is that HIV and AIDS, as reviewed by Chidalayenzi, came in about and it affected our family setup. And this happened in the form of death, right? You're finding that Jackie and her sister's family, the parents, died. And then the concept that is brought about was the concept of orphanhood. So the vulnerability of children, the susceptibility of children was culminated or was exacerbated by the fact that families died, parents died because of HIV and AIDS, because it was a new phenomenon in Zimbabwe. So what it affected was not only the children, but it was also transgenerational, because if you look at Masosa in the novel, she becomes the guardian of those children, of those grandchildren, right? And then this is how it affects them. And then you look at Shelter, then you look at Shelter's children. So HIV and AIDS as depicted by Chidalayenzi is something that has a very tremendous effect on the transgenerations, across generations. So this is one idea that Chidalayenzi is putting across. Now, if that is your point when you're writing, you then have to look at the third person narrator, because the third person narration is what the writer uses to critique, what the writer uses to then bring out a viewpoint of the world through a criticism of this in the society. So this is the third person narration, and also it is also done through flashbacks. When the writer reflects on the character's past, right? This is what Chidalayenzi uses. So what is important in literature is to identify the point, which is that the effect was on the family. And then furthermore, you go and look at how it affected the family. It was transgenerational. Then you give us the evidence, the contextual evidence, when you talk about Jackie's family. Then you bring out other things, such as orphanhood, right? These are things that happen there. But one of the things that I've seen in the novel, upon reading it, was the aspect of the cultural inclusion by Chidalayenzi. Now, what Chidalayenzi was talking about in the family setup and how it is affected by HIV and AIDS He then took the semantic field of our own tradition and he used a grandmother like Mbuya Masosa to then become the guardian. Now, why is that important when you have Mbuya Masosa here? Now, the importance of this lady, of this grandmother, is that she then illuminates and she then reflects on how society, our Zimbabwean African tradition is like, the role of the grandmothers. Now, the burden of then becoming a caregiver, right, is then thrust upon Mbuya Masosa, right, because of the loss. So, HIV and AIDS on the family, it talks about death, it talks about loss, it then brings about fragility, it then brings about susceptibility. And this is why when the writer then presents aspects like poverty here in the family setup, the reason why it is more exacerbated and it's more heightened is the fact that the family is under loss. It's under attack by the HIV and AIDS, because when Chidaba in this context, he was writing about a time when HIV and AIDS was still new and the concept was still ambiguous. People were not, there was no clarity in that. So these are the aspects that you bring about in the family. You see, you talk about the family unit, right? And in terms of the writing style, what you can also look at is that the writer uses a microcosm, right? When you talk about microcosm, we are saying that the writer uses just a piece, something small, something very little and the like. And then he uses it to magnify and to show wider societal issues. All right, so that's the first point that you talk about. Then when we're looking at the setting of the novel, we are looking at things like the urban contemporary society. All right, I'm going to allude on that. All right, so when we look at Chidaba and this writing style, when we talk about the setting, we're talking about an urban setting. Wow. Now, the contrast or the contrast between an urban life, right, and when you look at the rural life, there is a contrast in it. And the writer then brings and magnifies this to the frame, right? So when we talk about the urban society, there are pressures of life that Chidaba Enzi puts across. Why? Because our simple life, the simplicity of life, we talk about the communal way of life, is different than the life in the urban society. So the setting that Chidaba Enzi uses is a setting that is infused with what we call moral decadence, right? We are saying that our society is evolving, our society is transforming, our society is changing over and over again. And then moral decadence is one of the aspects that are very evident in the ties that bind. So this is the idea that he talks about. Now, when we talk about HIV and AIDS now, you have to specify the area that the writer is then talking about, the demography. Because in terms of characterization, right, characterization, we are talking about the presentation of the character. We are talking about how the writer gives you a character. Is the character a male? Is the character a female? Is the character young? Is the character old? Is the innocence presented? So now in terms of the moral decadence, the first thing we see is on the vulnerability of young girls, right? Vulnerability of young girls, right? But I must put a disclaimer on this one. When you're writing the vulnerability of young girls, this should not be your topic sentence. This should be the supporting sentence. Why? Because your question was never on the presentation of women. Your question was on the depiction of HIV and AIDS. But I'm saying HIV and AIDS should be part of your topic sentence, and the vulnerability of women, of young girls, shall be the focal point of your what? Of your argument, right? All right. So let me allude to that. So when you look at the urban setting, victims of the urban life has been young children, young girls, and this is typical even of our contemporary society. So what I believe in when you're analyzing a novel is that we have to link between what the writer is saying and how relevant it is in the context of the modern day society. So this is the idea that is brought about by Chidaba Enzi. So when you look at the vulnerability of young girls and why HIV and AIDS has become also rampant, it became rampant to their parents and it has become rampant to them. The idea of the vulnerability of women is shown through shelter in Synodia, right? Now, the writer in The Ties That Bind talks about the epidemic of HIV and AIDS as something new. We understand that. But then the writer goes further and then elaborates on the aspect of human choices, right? Because Chidagayenzi, as a pious and a religious writer, as a religious man, as a pastor, he had this semantics of religion embedded in his novel, right? So this knowledge, when he talks about, he then gives us a rhetoric to say, does choice take precedence over one's will, right? I'm saying that, like, if a person gets HIV and AIDS, is it because of circumstance or is it because of choice? Because Sinodia and Shelter are coming from very vulnerable families. And what the writer says, he says that even Biamasosa's love would not suffice the young girls, right? Biamasosa had love. And then the writer gives us a very visual imagery of them eating sada and what? And cabbage, and these are vegetables, right? Right. So then these young girls, because of wanting the luxuries of life, they then go forward and they objectify their bodies. So the vulnerability of women is on the objectification of the human body, right? Because Chidawayensis was also talking about the devaluation of the human body, right? The devaluation of women's bodies, right? Because women were using their own bodies, right, to trade and marketize them.